Imagine a world torn apart by war, where hunger gnaws at empty stomachs and the very idea of food becomes wrapped in pride, defiance, and survival. Picture German women standing in the rubble of their destroyed cities, their faces hardened by loss, their hearts heavy with defeat, looking at American soldiers offering them meat and turning away with cold refusal. This is not a story about pickiness or preference. This is a story about dignity clinging to the last thread of identity when everything else has been stripped away. This is about women who said no to beef, who rejected the help of their conquerors, who held their heads high even as their children cried from hunger. But then something extraordinary happened. Something smoky, tender, and impossibly delicious broke through walls of pride that bombs could never penetrate. This is the untold story of how Texas barbecue did what diplomacy could not, how the smell of slow-cooked brisket melted hearts frozen by war, and how food became the bridge between enemies who learned to see each other as human beings once again. This is the story of German women, American soldiers, cultural collision, and the unexpected power of a meal cooked with patience, smoke, and a touch of Texas magic. The year was 1945, and Germany lay in ruins. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to mountains of broken concrete and twisted steel. Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, Cologne, every major urban center bore the scars of relentless bombing campaigns that had turned day into night with smoke and fire. The war had ended, but the suffering had not. Millions of German civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men, wandered through the wreckage of their former lives, searching for food, shelter, and some semblance of normalcy in a world that had been completely shattered.
While the
German
propaganda
military had
promised glory
surrendered
and death and
unconditionally,
shame and
and now
surrender,
foreign
the
soldiers
actual
occupied
experience of
every corner
Japanese
of the
soldiers in the
defeated
Pacific
nation.
War told a
American,
different and
British,
far more brutal
French,
story.
and Soviet forces
The young men
divided
who went
Germany
off to
into
fight for
zones
the
of
emperor
control,
found themselves in a
each imposing
nightmare
their
that
own
no
systems
amount
of
of
governance
training or
and
indoctrination
reconstruction.
could have prepared
For
them for.
ordinary German women,
They were
this
sent to
meant living
remote
under the
islands,
authority of the very
thousands of
people
miles
they had
from
been
home,
taught to hate
islands
and fear
scattered across
throughout
the
the war
vast
years.
Pacific Ocean.
The
Many of them
psychological
nothing more
landscape
than
was
tiny
perhaps even
specks of
more
coral
devastated
and
than the
jungle.
physical one.
These
German
islands became
civilians had
prisons
endured
more than
years of
battlefields,
propaganda that painted
places
the
where
Allies,
Japanese soldiers found
particularly the
themselves cut off
Americans,
from all
as barbaric
support
invaders
as American
who would
forces
destroy
advanced
German
across
culture
the
and
ocean.
civilization.
The Japanese
Women
military
had
had
told
expanded
stories
so
of what would
rapidly,
happen when
had
enemy
conquered so
soldiers
much
arrived,
territory so
stories
quickly
designed to
that it
inspire
could not
desperate
possibly
resistance
supply
even
all
when
the troops
military
it had
defeat
scattered
became
across the
inevitable.
Pacific.
Now those
As the
soldiers
war
were
turned
here,
against Japan,
walking through German
as American
streets,
submarines sank
occupying
more
German
and more
buildings,
supply
and
ships,
offering
these
German civilians
isolated
food
garrisons
from their
began
own
to
military
starve.
supplies.
Starvation
The
became the
cognitive
greatest
dissonance
killer
was
of
profound.
Japanese soldiers
How could
in the
these young
Pacific
American
War.
men, many
Historical
barely out of their
research
teenage
suggests
years,
that between
smiling
60
and
and
offering chocolate to
70%
children,
of all
be the
Japanese
monsters
military
described
deaths
in
were
propaganda.
caused not by
And
bullets
yet
or
accepting
bombs,
their help
but by
felt like
starvation
betrayal,
and
like admitting
diseases
defeat not
related
just
to
militarily,
malnutrition.
but culturally
Let that stagger
and
you
morally
for a
as
moment.
well.
More than
German
half
women
of
found
all
themselves
Japanese
caught
soldiers who
between
died in the
desperate
war
physical need
died because
and
they had
equally
nothing to
desperate
eat.
psychological resistance.
On islands like
between
Guadalcanal,
hunger
New
and
Guinea,
pride,
and the
between
Philippines,
survival
Japanese
and
soldiers
identity.
faced conditions
In the
that
immediate
descended
aftermath
into
of Germany's
pure horror.
surrender, a strange
Official
phenomenon
rations were
emerged
supposed to
in the
provide
American
each soldier
occupation
with
zones.
adequate food.
Military
But as
authorities
supply
had
lines
established
collapsed,
food
those
distribution
rations
centers
became a
to prevent
fantasy.
mass starvation
Men
among
were
the
given
civilian
tiny
population.
handfuls of rice,
The logistics
sometimes
were
only
complex,
once every
involving
few
the
days.
transportation of
Soldiers
thousands of
began
tons
to
of
eat
food supplies
anything they
from
could
the United
find.
States to
They
feed
stripped
not just
bark
American
from trees
troops,
and boiled
but
it
also
into a
the
thin
defeated
soup.
German population.
They caught insects,
Among
rats,
these supplies
and
were
any small
significant
animals they
quantities
could trap.
of beef,
They
both
dug up
fresh and
roots and
preserved,
tried to eat
a
plants
staple
that
of the
made them
American
violently
military
ill.
diet.
As
American
weeks turned
soldiers,
into months
many
and
from
months
farming
turned
and
into
ranching
years,
backgrounds,
these soldiers
viewed beef
wasted
as
away.
fundamental sustenance,
Men who had
the
weighed
cornerstone
60
of
kilograms
proper
when they
nutrition.
arrived saw
They could
their
not
weight
imagine
drop
a
to
diet
50
without it,
kilograms,
and
then
they
40,
assumed that hungry
their
people
bodies
would
consuming
gratefully
themselves
accept
to stay
any
alive.
food offered,
Disease
They were
followed
wrong.
starvation like a shadow.
German women began
Malaria
refusing
swept
the
through
beef.
these weakened men,
At distribution
causing
centers
fevers
across
that
the
could kill
American
in
zones,
days.
from Bavaria,
Dysentery
Hesse,
turned
to
their
parts of Berlin,
intestines into sources
military
of agony,
personnel reported the same
dehydrating
puzzling
them even
pattern.
as they searched
Women would
desperately
accept
for clean
flour,
water.
potatoes,
Very,
canned
very
vegetables,
caused by lack
and
of
even
vitamins
unfamiliar
made
American
their limbs
products
swell
like peanut
and their
butter.
hearts fail.
But when offered beef,
Tropical
they would
ulcers
shake their
ate
heads
away
and
at their
turn away.
skin, creating
Some
wounds
did so
that would
silently,
not heal.
with expressions that
Men
mixed
died
pride
slowly,
and pain.
day by day.
Others were more
their
vocal,
bodies failing
explaining
piece
in
by
broken
piece,
English or
while their
through
minds tried to
interpreters
hold on to
that
the
they
beliefs
would not eat
that
it,
had brought
could
them to
not
these
eat it,
terrible
that it
places.
was wrong somehow.
The code demanded they
American
die with
soldiers
honor,
were
but there was no honor
They
in
saw
dying
children
from
with hollow
disease in a
cheeks and
jungle while
protruding
your body
ribs standing
rotted
beside
around
their
you.
mothers,
There was
clearly
only
malnourished,
suffering and the growing
desperately needing
realization
protein,
that
and yet
everything they
these
had
women
been promised was a
refused
lie.
meat that could save
Yet
their children
even in
from
these
starvation.
conditions, the indoctrination held its grip.
Incomprehensible,
Soldiers who
irrational,
considered surrender
almost
faced not
criminally
only their
stubborn.
own internal shame,
The
but
reasons
the
for this
reactions of their
refusal were
comrades.
complex and
In some units,
multi-layered,
officers would
rooted in
shoot
history,
soldiers who
culture,
suggested giving
and
up.
the specific
Men
circumstances
who were
of
too
the
weak
war's
to
end.
continue fighting were
In
sometimes
traditional
given
German food
grenades and
culture,
told to commit
beef had never
suicide
occupied
so they
the
would not
central
burden the
position it
unit
held
or
in
fall
American
into
cuisine.
enemy hands.
German
The
cooking had
military had
historically
created
favored
a system
pork,
where
with
soldiers
its
were
various
trapped between the
sausages,
certainty of
schnitzels,
death
and
by
roasts,
starvation
forming
and
the
the
foundation
absolute
of meat
prohibition
consumption.
against surrender.
Beef was
They
eaten,
died
certainly,
in their
but it was
thousands,
often considered
alone on
somewhat
forgotten
foreign,
islands,
associated with
convinced that
French
their
cuisine,
sacrifice had
or the
meaning,
aristocratic
even as their
tables
own
of the
government
pre-war
abandoned them
rather
to their
than
fate.
everyday German family
And all the
meals.
while, the
More
propaganda
importantly,
continued
in
to
the
tell
final
them
years of
that
the war,
Americans were
as
monsters,
food became
that
increasingly
capture meant
scarce,
torture
the
and
Nazi
death,
regime
that
had
the only
implemented
honorable
strict
path
rationing
was to
systems.
fight until
Beef
the
had
end.
virtually disappeared from civilian markets, requisitioned for military use, or simply unavailable due to the collapse of agricultural systems. For years, German women had cooked meals without beef, had learned to create satisfying dishes from potatoes, cabbage, turnips, and whatever small amounts of pork or preserved meats they could obtain. They had adapted, survived, and maintained their families without it. But the refusal went deeper than mere unfamiliarity or dietary preference. Accepting beef from American soldiers carried symbolic weight that the soldiers themselves did not understand. To accept food from the conquerors was to acknowledge defeat on the most intimate, domestic level. Food is never just fuel. It represents culture, tradition, family, and identity. For German women who had lost husbands, brothers, and sons in the war, who had seen their homes destroyed and their country divided, who had endured years of hardship and terror, food was one of the few domains where they still exercised agency and dignity. In their kitchens, in their choices about what to cook and what to feed their children, they could maintain some shred of independence and dignity. Accepting American beef felt like surrendering that last fortress of independence, like admitting that even in the most basic human activity of feeding one's family, they now depended on their former enemies. The refusal was not about the beef itself. It was about everything the beef represented. Living under occupation creates psychological dynamics that outsiders struggle to comprehend. For the American soldiers stationed in Germany, most of whom were young men from small towns across the United States, the experience was profoundly disorienting. They had been trained to fight Germans, to view them as enemies, as the soldiers of a regime that had committed unspeakable atrocities. They had seen the concentration camps, witnessed the evidence of systematic murder, and felt justified rage at what the Nazi government had done. Yet now they found themselves responsible for feeding and protecting German civilians, most of whom were women and children, who seemed as much victims of the war as anyone else. The cognitive dissonance affected them too. How were they supposed to hate and help simultaneously? How could they reconcile their knowledge of German crimes with the reality of German suffering?
In the summer of 1945, the 36th Infantry Division, a Texas National Guard unit that had fought its way through Italy and southern France before entering Germany, was stationed in the American occupation zone in Bavaria. The division was largely composed of men from Texas, Oklahoma, and surrounding states, regions with strong ranching and barbecue traditions. These were men who had grown up around cattle, who understood beef not just as meat, but as culture, as a way of life deeply connected to their regional identity. They had fought hard through the war, seen terrible things, lost many comrades, and now found themselves tasked with occupation duties that felt frustratingly unrelated to what they had trained for. They were restless, bored, and looking for ways to make their situation more bearable. Among these Texans was a mess sergeant named William Bill Henderson, a man from the hill country west of Austin who had worked on his family's ranch before the war and who possessed what his fellow soldiers described as an almost mystical ability to cook beef. Back home, Henderson had been famous for his barbecue, for briskets that he smoked for 16 hours until the meat fell apart at the touch of a fork, for ribs glazed with his secret sauce, for the way he could take tough cuts of meat and transform them into something transcendent. In the Army, he had been frustrated by the constraints of military cooking, by the need to prepare food quickly and efficiently for large numbers of men, by the lack of proper equipment and ingredients. But now, stationed in Bavaria with access to adequate supplies and time on his hands, Henderson began to think about barbecue again. He was not alone in his thinking. Other Texans in the unit shared his frustration with the food situation and his belief that the problem was not the beef itself, but how it was being prepared and presented. They had watched German women turn away from boiled beef, from the standard military preparations that rendered meat gray and relatively tasteless, from the institutional approach to cooking that stripped food of personality and character. These Texans understood instinctively what the nutritionists and military administrators did not: that people do not eat nutrients, they eat food, and food carries meaning beyond its chemical composition. They believed that if they could show German women what Texas barbecue was, how beef could be transformed into something special and communal and celebratory, the resistance might crumble. Henderson approached his commanding officer with a proposal. He wanted to organize a barbecue event for the local German community to demonstrate proper beef preparation, to share a piece of Texas culture, to bridge the gap between occupiers and occupied through food. The officer was skeptical at first, worried about the logistics and the potential for the event to be misunderstood or to create problems. But Henderson was persuasive, and he had the support of other Texans in the unit who volunteered to help. Eventually, permission was granted, with the stipulation that the event be carefully controlled and supervised, that German community leaders be consulted and involved, and that it be presented as a cultural exchange rather than an attempt to force American ways onto German people.
What happened next would be remembered and recounted for years afterward by everyone who was present. The first German woman to taste the brisket was named Frau Schmidt, a grandmother who had lost 2 sons in the war and who had been among the most vocal in refusing American beef at the distribution centers. She cut a small piece, placed it in her mouth with visible reluctance, and began to chew. Her expression changed. The suspicion and resistance faded, replaced by something like astonishment. She chewed slowly, thoughtfully, her eyes widening slightly. She swallowed. She looked at the meat on her plate as if seeing it for the first time. Then she cut another piece, larger this time, and ate it with more enthusiasm. Around the table, other women were having similar experiences, their faces registering surprise and pleasure that they could not quite hide. The transformation was not universal or immediate for everyone, but something undeniable was happening. Women who had refused beef for months were now eating it, not from desperation, but with genuine appetite and appreciation. They asked for seconds. They commented to each other in German, their voices animated in ways they had not been since the war ended. The Texans watched with barely contained excitement, grinning at each other, feeling vindicated in their belief that the right preparation could make all the difference. Henderson moved through the crowd with more platters of meat, serving ribs now, watching as German children gnawed on bones with enthusiasm that made their mothers laugh, real laughter that cut through the grim atmosphere that had hung over the community for so long. The barbecue lasted into the afternoon, becoming less formal and more celebratory as time passed. German women began to relax, to talk more freely with the American soldiers, to ask questions not just about cooking, but about Texas, about American life, about these men who had brought them this meal. The soldiers in turn asked about German cooking, about regional dishes, about food traditions that had been disrupted by the war. They found common ground in talking about family recipes, about grandmothers who guarded cooking secrets, about the smells of home kitchens and holiday meals. Food became a language that transcended the actual languages being spoken, a way of communicating that bypassed the barriers of nationality and recent history. Frau Schmidt approached Henderson directly, speaking through an interpreter. She wanted to understand how he had made the meat so tender, so flavorful, so different from any beef she had ever tasted. Henderson explained the process as best he could, talking about time and temperature and smoke, about the patience required to let tough meat break down slowly, about the way fat renders and bastes from within. He spoke with passion and pride, and even though the interpreter had to translate his words, his enthusiasm needed no translation. Frau Schmidt listened carefully, nodding, asking follow-up questions that revealed a cook's understanding of what he was describing. At the end of the conversation, she said something to the interpreter that was then translated for Henderson. She said that she had been wrong to refuse the beef, that she had not understood what was possible, that this was not just meat but something more, something that spoke of care and skill and tradition that she could respect. News of the barbecue spread through the German community with remarkable speed. In a time before television or internet, when communication depended on word of mouth and face-to-face conversation, the story moved like wildfire. Women who had attended the barbecue told their neighbors and friends about the incredible meat the Texans had prepared, about how different it was from anything they had expected, about how the American soldiers had shown them respect and hospitality rather than condescension or control. The story grew in the telling, acquiring details and emphasis that highlighted the most compelling elements. It became a story about transformation, about discovering that things you had rejected might contain unexpected value, about the possibility of finding connection across seemingly unbridgeable divides. Within weeks, something remarkable happened at the food distribution centers. The refusal of beef did not disappear entirely, but it decreased dramatically in the areas where news of the barbecue had spread. More importantly, the nature of the interaction changed. Women who accepted beef now sometimes asked questions about how to prepare it, whether there were American methods that might make it more palatable, whether there would be more events where they could learn different cooking techniques. The military government, recognizing an opportunity, began to organize more food-related cultural exchanges. They brought in soldiers from different American regions to demonstrate various cooking styles. They created simple printed guides to American recipes, translated into German, distributed through the distribution centers. They even began to allow some German women to work in military kitchens, learning American cooking methods firsthand. The Texans in the 36th Infantry Division found themselves in unexpected demand as ambassadors of barbecue culture. Henderson and his crew were asked to repeat their demonstration in other communities throughout Bavaria. Each event followed a similar pattern: initial skepticism, the long hours of smoking meat, the building anticipation, the moment of first tasting, and the gradual breaking down of resistance. Not every event was as successful as the first one, and some German communities remained resistant longer than others, but the overall trajectory was clear. Food was accomplishing what military authority could not, building bridges where force had only created wider gaps. The Texans took pride in this role, feeling that they were representing their home region and their country in a way that felt more meaningful than occupation duties ever could. The phenomenon was not limited to American-German interactions.
British and French occupation forces, hearing about the success of the barbecue events, began their own food-related cultural exchanges, sharing their traditional cooking traditions with German communities. The British introduced traditional Sunday roasts and afternoon tea customs. The French, despite their complicated history with Germany, found that food could create a neutral ground where past grievances could be temporarily set aside. These events became a subtle but important part of the occupation strategy, a way of humanizing the occupiers and creating opportunities for positive interaction that counterbalanced the inevitable tensions and resentments that occupation always generates. Military psychologists and sociologists studying the occupation began to pay attention to these food-based cultural exchanges, recognizing that something significant was occurring. They conducted interviews and wrote reports trying to understand why barbecue had succeeded where other approaches had failed. Their findings revealed complex dynamics of culture, gender, and power that are still studied today by scholars of occupation and post-conflict reconstruction. The success of the barbecue events was not simply about better tasting meat, though that was certainly a factor. It was about a constellation of elements that came together in a unique way. First, the events bypassed the usual power dynamics of occupation by positioning the Americans as sharing something rather than imposing something. When soldiers demonstrated barbecue, they were showing vulnerability and pride simultaneously, opening themselves to judgment about something they cared deeply about. Creating a situation where German women could respond as critics and connoisseurs rather than as defeated subjects accepting charity, this subtle shift in power dynamics made a psychological difference. German women could maintain dignity while participating, could accept the food without feeling acceptance equaled submission, could engage with the Americans as fellow human beings with different but equally valid cultural traditions.
To truly understand this story, we must listen to the voices of the German women themselves, recorded in interviews conducted years later when enough time had passed that they could speak more freely about those difficult post-war years. Frau Schmidt, the grandmother who had been among the first to taste Henderson's brisket, was interviewed in the 1970s as part of an oral history project about the occupation period. She spoke with remarkable clarity about her feelings during that time, about the complexity of emotions that every decision carried, about the psychological burden of living under foreign control while trying to maintain family and identity. She explained that refusing the beef had been about control at a time when she had control over almost nothing else. Her sons were dead, her husband had been killed in the First War, her home had been partially destroyed by bombing, her savings were worthless, her country was divided and occupied. The only realm where she could still make decisions, where her choices mattered, was in what she cooked and what she fed to her surviving grandchildren. Accepting beef from the Americans felt like surrendering that last tiny fortress of independence. She knew it was irrational. She knew her grandchildren needed protein, but rationality was not enough to overcome the deep psychological need to resist, to say no to something, to assert that even in defeat, she remained a person with the power to refuse. The barbecue event had changed things because it approached her differently. The Texans had not tried to convince her that she was wrong to refuse beef. They had not lectured her about nutrition or made her feel foolish for her resistance. Instead, they had invited her to judge their cooking, to evaluate their skill, to participate in a cultural exchange where her opinion and expertise mattered. This approach respected her dignity in a way that the simple distribution of food never could. When she tasted the brisket and found it extraordinary, her acceptance of it felt like a choice she was making, an acknowledgement of genuine quality rather than a surrender to necessity. This psychological distinction was everything. Other women interviewed told similar stories with different details. Frau Mueller, a younger woman with 3 small children, talked about the guilt she felt every time she refused beef at the distribution center, knowing her children were hungry, hating herself for letting pride override maternal duty, but unable to stop herself. The barbecue event had given her permission to accept, had created a context where accepting felt honorable rather than shameful. Frau Becker, a former schoolteacher, talked about the importance of the cultural exchange aspect, how learning about Texas and American ranching traditions and barbecue culture had reminded her that there was a wider world beyond the devastation of Germany, that life and culture and tradition continued elsewhere, that someday perhaps German culture and life could be rebuilt too. These women's testimonies revealed that the story of refusing beef and then accepting barbecue was never really about food at all. It was about psychological survival, about maintaining identity under impossible circumstances, about the human need for dignity and agency even in defeat. The Texans had understood this instinctively, even if they could not have articulated it in psychological terms. They had recognized that people are not machines that simply need fuel, that eating is a profoundly social and cultural act, that breaking bread together is one of the oldest and most powerful ways that humans create connection and community. By approaching German women through shared appreciation of food, rather than through charity or authority, they had opened a door that had seemed permanently closed. The success of the barbecue events and similar cultural exchanges began to influence broader occupation policy in ways that military planners had not anticipated. Reports from military government officials in Bavaria noting the dramatic improvement in civilian cooperation and reduction in tensions in communities where food-based cultural exchanges had occurred caught the attention of higher-level commanders and civilian administrators. The pragmatic American military, always willing to adopt strategies that worked regardless of whether they fit preconceived plans, began to incorporate cultural exchange programs into official occupation policy across the American zone. This shift represented a significant change in thinking about post-conflict reconstruction and occupation. Traditional military thinking about occupation focused primarily on security, maintaining order, preventing insurgency, and establishing administrative control. Cultural matters were generally considered peripheral, something to be handled by civilian specialists, if at all. But the German experience was demonstrating that culture was not peripheral but central, that winning hearts and minds required engaging with people on the level of everyday life and identity, that food and cooking and domestic culture were legitimate and effective tools of diplomacy and reconciliation. The military government began funding community centers where American soldiers and German civilians could interact in structured but informal ways. These centers featured cooking demonstrations, language classes, sports activities, and cultural presentations. They created spaces where positive interactions could occur, where relationships could develop, where the humanity of both occupiers and occupied could be acknowledged. The centers were not universally successful, and they faced resistance from Germans who saw them as propaganda tools, and from American soldiers who were uncomfortable with the ambiguity of being both occupiers and friends. But in many communities, they became valued institutions that helped ease the transition from war to peace, from enmity to coexistence.
To understand why the beef refusal and barbecue acceptance mattered so much, we need to understand the deeper context of German food culture during and after the war. The Nazi period had profoundly disrupted traditional German foodways in ways that are difficult for people who did not live through it to fully grasp. The regime had implemented increasingly draconian rationing systems that fundamentally altered what and how Germans ate. By the final years of the war, the German diet had been reduced to a monotonous and inadequate rotation of potatoes, turnips, bread made with substitute flours, and occasional small portions of poor quality meat. Butter, eggs, milk, sugar, and many other staples had virtually disappeared from civilian markets. This radical dietary disruption had profound effects beyond simple hunger, though hunger was certainly omnipresent. Food represents continuity with the past, connection to family and tradition, a tangible expression of cultural identity. When people lose their traditional foods, when they can no longer prepare the dishes their mothers and grandmothers taught them, when family recipes cannot be made because the ingredients do not exist, something deeper than nutrition is lost. The Nazi food system had severed Germans from their culinary heritage, had made traditional food culture impossible to maintain, had replaced regional and family food traditions with the grim uniformity of rationing and scarcity. The end of the war did not immediately restore what had been lost. It brought different foods from different sources, but not the restoration of traditional German foodways. In this context, the refusal of American beef can be understood as an attempt to draw a line, to say that even if everything else had been taken away, even if traditional food culture could not be fully maintained, at least Germans would not be forced to adopt foreign foodways. The beef represented not just a different food, but a different food culture, an American way of eating that felt alien to German tradition. Accepting it felt like one more loss, one more piece of German identity surrendered to the conquerors. The fact that pre-war German cuisine had included beef was almost irrelevant. In the symbolic landscape of defeat, American beef became a marker of American cultural dominance, something to be resisted as a matter of cultural self-preservation. The barbecue events worked precisely because they did not try to eliminate this concern, but instead reframed it. The Texans were not trying to make Germans eat like Americans. They were sharing a regional American tradition, openly acknowledging it as specifically Texan, rather than claiming it represented some universal or superior way of eating. This framing made it possible for German women to accept and appreciate the barbecue without feeling that they were betraying their own culture. They could enjoy Texas barbecue the way they might enjoy Italian pasta or French wine, as a foreign specialty that could be appreciated without displacing native traditions. This subtle but crucial distinction made acceptance psychologically possible in a way that simple food distribution never could. Among the German women who attended those first barbecue events were individuals whose personal stories illuminate the broader historical patterns. Frau Hartmann was a widow whose husband had been killed on the Eastern Front and whose brother had died in Allied bombing of Hamburg. She had every reason to hate Americans, to refuse any gesture of goodwill, to maintain bitter resentment about what the war had taken from her. She came to the barbecue event reluctantly, brought by a neighbor who insisted she needed to leave her damaged apartment and be among people. She sat at the tables with arms crossed, face closed, determined not to participate more than absolutely necessary. But Henderson noticed her isolation and deliberately approached her with the first slices of brisket. He did not speak German, and she spoke no English, but he smiled and placed the plate before her with a small bow that somehow communicated respect. She looked at him with surprise, not expecting this courtesy from a soldier of the occupying army. She ate the meat mechanically at first, not really tasting it, still locked in her determination to remain uninvolved. But the flavor broke through her resistance. She found herself genuinely enjoying it, which confused and distressed her. How could she enjoy anything these Americans provided? How could she feel gratitude toward representatives of the nations that had killed her husband and brother? Over the following months, Frau Hartmann struggled with these conflicting emotions. She continued to attend cultural events at the newly established community center, drawn by the food and eventually by the human connections that developed despite her initial resistance. She began to distinguish between the Nazi government that had led Germany into catastrophic war and the ordinary German people who had suffered the consequences, and to make a similar distinction between the Allied governments and policies that had caused such destruction and the individual American soldiers who were now trying, however imperfectly, to help civilians survive. These distinctions did not erase her grief or make the war's losses acceptable, but they created space for her to move forward, to rebuild life, to acknowledge that individuals could show decency even within systems of violence and occupation. Her story was repeated in countless variations across occupied Germany. Individuals made small personal breakthroughs that collectively constituted a massive social transformation. Germany moved from being an enemy nation to a partner in the Cold War, from occupation to sovereignty, from devastation to prosperity, through a million individual decisions by people like Frau Hartmann to accept help, to engage with former enemies, to choose reconstruction over continued resentment. The barbecue events and similar cultural exchanges were tiny elements in this massive transformation, but they mattered because they operated at the human scale, affecting individual people at moments when those individuals were making decisions about how to understand their experiences and how to move forward. When the 36th Infantry Division began rotating soldiers back to the United States in late 1945 and 1946, the men brought home stories of their time in occupied Germany. For many Texans, the barbecue events had been among the most meaningful experiences of their service, more significant in some ways than combat, because they had created connection rather than destruction. Bill Henderson returned to his ranch in the Texas Hill Country and resumed his civilian life, but he never forgot the look on Frau Schmidt's face when she tasted his brisket, the way food had broken through walls of resentment and fear, the proof that his culture and skills had value beyond his own community. Henderson and other returning soldiers talked about their experiences at VFW halls, social sots, and wherever veterans congregated. Their stories entered the collective memory of Texas and the broader American South, becoming part of the narrative about World War II and its aftermath. These stories emphasized American generosity, the power of cultural exchange, the basic decency of American soldiers, and the ways that American culture could win over even those who had been enemies. They were in many ways idealized stories, emphasizing the positive moments and downplaying the many difficulties and failures of the occupation. But they also contained important truths about the power of respect and reciprocity in human relations, truths that transcended the specific historical context.
In the decades following the war, historians, sociologists, and military strategists studied the American occupation of Germany extensively, trying to understand what had worked, what had failed, and what lessons could be applied to future conflicts and post-conflict situations. The story of the beef refusal and barbecue acceptance became a minor but persistent element in these analyses, cited as an example of the importance of cultural sensitivity and the power of informal, human-level interactions in occupation contexts. Academic papers with titles like Food as Diplomacy, Cultural Exchange in Occupied Germany, and Soft Power and Post-Conflict Reconstruction, Lessons from the American Occupation Zone, examined the phenomenon in detail. Military strategists were particularly interested in understanding why informal cultural exchanges had succeeded where official programs sometimes failed. The barbecue events had not been planned by high-level commanders or civilian administrators. They had emerged organically from the initiative of soldiers on the ground who recognized a problem and applied cultural knowledge and common sense to address it. This bottom-up quality made the events effective, but also made them difficult to replicate systematically. Military training programs began incorporating lessons about cultural sensitivity and the importance of empowering junior leaders to improvise culturally appropriate responses to local situations. But institutionalizing flexibility and cultural awareness proved challenging for organizations designed around hierarchy and standardization. The academic analysis also revealed the gendered dimensions of the story. The beef refusal had been primarily a phenomenon among women, and the barbecue events had succeeded partly because they engaged women on their own terms, in the domestic sphere where they retained authority and expertise. This pattern reflected broader realities of occupation.
where women, as the majority of the adult civilian population remaining in Germany after military-age men had been killed or captured, played crucial roles in how communities responded to occupation. Understanding and engaging with women's perspectives and concerns was essential to occupation success. Yet military organizations remained overwhelmingly male and often failed to recognize the importance of gender dynamics in post-conflict situations. The story also raised questions about cultural imperialism and the politics of soft power. Some critics argued that the barbecue events, however well-intentioned, were still part of a broader American project of cultural dominance. That introducing Texas barbecue to Germany was an early example of the cultural globalization that would eventually spread American food, entertainment, values, and commercial products across the world. From this perspective, the beef refusal represented legitimate cultural resistance, and its eventual breakdown through barbecue events was not a triumph but a loss, the beginning of a process that would erode distinctive national food cultures in favor of global homogenization dominated by American cultural forms. Today, more than 75 years after those first barbecue events in occupied Bavaria, the story lives on in multiple forms. In Germany, it is sometimes told as part of the larger narrative about the occupation period and the reconstruction that followed, a small human story within the massive historical transformation that created modern Germany. Older Germans who lived through the period sometimes remember the American soldiers and the food they brought, though memories have faded and been reshaped by time. Some German communities maintain traditions of cultural exchange with American communities, relationships that trace their origins back to the occupation period and the personal connections formed then. In Texas and the American South, the story has become part of regional mythology, evidence of barbecue's cultural power and Texas's positive role in world affairs. Barbecue restaurants and museums sometimes display historical photos and documents related to the occupation period barbecue events. The story is told to emphasize Texas generosity, cultural confidence, and the universal appeal of properly cooked meat. It feeds into narratives about American exceptionalism and the benevolent nature of American military interventions, narratives that remain politically important and contested in contemporary American culture. Military training programs still use the story, often in simplified form, as an example of cultural awareness and innovative problem-solving in complex post-conflict environments. It appears in PowerPoint presentations about winning hearts and minds, about the importance of cultural knowledge, about empowering junior leaders to take initiative. Whether these lessons are genuinely understood and applied in subsequent conflicts is debatable, but the story persists as an ideal, an example of occupation done right, a moment when Americans successfully bridged cultural divides and created positive change through respect and engagement rather than force. For scholars of food and culture, the story raises fascinating questions about food's role in creating and maintaining cultural boundaries and in crossing those boundaries. Food is simultaneously one of the most conservative aspects of culture, resistant to change and deeply tied to identity, and one of the most flexible, constantly incorporating new influences and adapting to new circumstances. The German women who refused beef and then accepted barbecue were navigating this tension, protecting cultural identity while remaining open to new experiences, maintaining boundaries while allowing connection. Understanding how this navigation occurs, the psychological and social factors that determine when boundaries hold firm and when they become permeable, remains relevant to understanding globalization, migration, cultural exchange, and conflict resolution today. The story of beef refusal and barbecue acceptance in occupied Germany was not unique. Similar patterns of food-related resistance followed by culturally sensitive reconciliation appeared in other post-war contexts, suggesting that the dynamics identified in Germany reflected broader human responses to defeat and occupation. In Japan, American occupation forces encountered different but parallel situations, where food became a site of cultural negotiation and eventual understanding. Japanese civilians initially resisted certain American foods, particularly dairy products that were not traditional in Japanese cuisine, but gradually accepted them, especially when presented in ways that respected Japanese culinary aesthetics and customs. In post-war Italy, where the presence of American forces was less politically fraught because Italy had switched sides before the war ended, food interactions took different forms but still played crucial roles in shaping relationships between Americans and Italians. American soldiers introduced Italian civilians to new foods and cooking methods, while Italian food culture profoundly influenced American soldiers, many of whom returned home with new appreciation for Italian cuisine. This cultural exchange, operating in both directions more freely than in Germany, helped create the explosion of Italian-American food culture that transformed American eating habits in the post-war decades. More recently, in conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, American military forces again encountered situations where food became a critical element of cultural interaction and misunderstanding. Military planners aware of historical precedents, including the German barbecue story, attempted to use food-related cultural exchanges as tools of diplomacy and relationship building. These efforts met with mixed success, partly because the cultural gaps were larger, partly because the political and religious dimensions of these conflicts created additional complications, and partly because the lessons from Germany were not always understood deeply enough to be applied effectively. Simply knowing that food matters is not the same as understanding how to use food appropriately in specific cultural contexts. The persistence of these patterns across different conflicts and cultures suggests something fundamental about human psychology and social organization. Food is universally important, tied to the most basic human needs and to the most complex cultural meanings. It operates simultaneously at the physical and symbolic levels, affecting both body and identity. This dual nature makes food a powerful medium for conflict and reconciliation, a site where fundamental human needs and deep cultural values intersect. Understanding these dynamics remains crucial for anyone working in post-conflict reconstruction, international development, refugee resettlement, or any context where people from different cultures must find ways to coexist and cooperate despite difficult histories. The story of German women who refused to eat beef until they discovered Texas barbecue is ultimately a story about human dignity, cultural respect, and the unexpected pathways to reconciliation that can emerge even in the bleakest circumstances. It reminds us that the end of war does not mean the end of conflict,